Okay, so one of the questions that I get fairly often about the auroras is how do you combine multiple experiments? And now that we have two auroras, how do we deal with experiments on both of the auroras and how you combine them? So I figured it's actually kind of a bit of a complicated answer, so it seemed to make sense to make some visual diagrams to explain how to do this. So we have two auroras that are exactly identical, meaning that we ordered the exact same thing. So to distinguish them, we've called them the aurora blue and the aurora green. So the detector setup is entirely the same, but I've since learned that there are some things inside the instrument that do make each aurora unique, which makes combining experiments a little bit more complicated. But basically, this is just kind of an overview of all of your options for running samples. So let's say you have samples that you run, and we'll call it on day one. So you've got your reference controls, you've got your samples for one single experiment. You obviously have an option if you want to run those on the aurora blue or the green, because they are essentially the same thing. And then let's say you want to repeat this experiment 7 days later. So you have the exact same panel, very similar set of samples, so you can come back and run your new samples, and they may potentially have their own set of reference controls that you are rerunning. And so you can run your day 7 samples on either the blue or the green. So when you are thinking about setting up your experiment, how do you set it up so you can get the most optimal unmixing results? Which combination of these experiments should we combine? So the most obvious way to combine experiments is to treat each experiment individually. So let's say you have your first experiment on day 1 with your reference controls and samples run on the same day, same instrument. That's all in one single experiment. You unmix that all together, and then you want to repeat that, so you come back on day 7 and you bring a full set of reference controls and corresponding samples, and that is a new experiment that is unmixed all together. So you're unmixing twice here. Each experiment is its own, and then when you do your analysis, like when you're gating or if you want to concatenate files to do t-SNE analysis, you combine both of these experiment samples together. That is perfectly acceptable to do. Now, you could also do that with the multiple auroras. So if you have day 1 that's run on the aurora blue and day 7 is run on the aurora green, as long as you have reference controls, you basically have a full experiment, you can unmix each experiment separately and then do the analysis all together. Now, you're probably watching this video because you likely have a larger panel, and it may be pretty challenging to bring reference controls for every single experiment because, if your panel's 25, 30 markers, that's a lot of tubes to be running every single time. So you're probably wondering about how you can not bring reference controls every single time, but still get good results in your unmixing. And basically, there are 2 rules to follow when you're trying to unmix or use one set of reference controls to unmix multiple days worth of samples. First of all, your reference controls must be used to unmix samples that are run on the exact same instrument. So you can't mix and match instruments. You have to stay within the instrument if you're going to use your reference controls for different sets of samples. Now, the second, rule, I'm calling it a rule, I don't know if it's really a rule, but second fact gets a little bit more confusing, but is only important if you plan on unmixing your data on a different computer. So if you're doing your unmixing on the actual instrument that you ran your samples on, then you can ignore this. But if you are transferring your FCS files to a different copy of SpectroFlow, so if you're using a workstation in our lab that has SpectroFlow on it, or if you have acquired your own copy of SpectroFlow for your personal computer and you want to transfer your FCS files and experiment layout to a different copy of SpectroFlow, so you're not using the Aurora computer, then you should be aware of this issue. So ideally, if your computer has the QC report, so if you're using the instrument computer, you obviously run QC on the instrument and the reports get saved on that computer. So the QC reports are there, the ones that correspond to the days that you ran your experiment, then everything is going to work really nicely. So what happens when the unmixing gets done? Your sample FCS file is going to be linked to the corresponding QC report. It's going to get normalized to the QC report for that day. So your day 1 sample is going to be normalized to the day 1 QC report. Your day 7 sample is going to be normalized to the day 7 QC report. And that gets factored into the unmixing and helps improve the quality of the unmixing if you're doing different days. Again, if you're running everything on the same day, you don't have to worry about all of this QC report matching and whatnot. So what happens if you transfer your data to a different computer, then you obviously don't have the QC reports on that computer, so it's not going to be able to utilize those QC reports. It still works. You're going to be able to unmix the data, but you're just going to not get that benefit of normalizing to the QC reports. So if you're using a different computer, please contact the core. We will help you get set up with the instrument data. We'll export that off the computer for you, and you can transfer that onto your own computer so that you can benefit from having the normalization to the QC report. So just keep that in mind. If you're using a different computer, if you have files that are run on different days, you're also going to want to grab the QC reports off the computer. Do that by contacting anyone in our facility. So this means that if you have samples from different days, so we have our day 1 samples and our day 7 samples, if we put these all in the same experiment and we use a single set of reference controls, and that is used to unmix all of the data from both days, that's going to work perfectly fine. Again, it works best on the instrument. If you have a different computer, you've got to transfer instrument data. It doesn't matter which day you have the controls, so whether you use day 1 reference controls or day 7 reference controls to unmix your samples from day 1 to day 7, either way works. Assuming that you have good quality reference controls, this should give you good results for your unmixing. Now, another possibly better way to do this, if you do happen to have 2 sets of reference controls, then you can use your second set of reference controls. You can import that into your experiment and basically have the second set of reference controls as sample tubes. So you use your first set of reference controls in the reference group, and then your second set of reference controls basically as sample tubes. So you have a single set of reference controls that is used to unmix all of the data in both experiments, but then you have the second set of reference controls to check how well the day 1 controls unmixed the day 7 samples and controls. So if you have 2 sets of reference controls, but you want to combine your data, you can set up your unmixing in this way. And that will help you assess how well the unmixing worked on the second day of samples. Now, what you don't want to do is mix and match the 2 different auroras. So if you have samples that were run, let's say your day 1 samples were run on the aurora blue, the day 7 samples were run on the aurora green, you can't use the reference controls from one data set and apply it to both sets of samples because the samples were run on different instruments. You can only apply reference controls to samples run on different days if they are all run on the same instrument. So I should also specify, when I say that you can't do something, I mean in terms of having good data. It's not to say that the software will not let you unmix the data in this way. You can certainly set up your experiment like this. You can have samples from different computers, different auroras, and the software will let you unmix if you set your experiment up this way. But you're not going to get good results if you set up your experiment this way because you have samples from different auroras. So, for best results, you should not set up your experiments like this. You should make sure that you run all of your samples on the same aurora as your controls. And again, unfortunately, there isn't any sort of notification in the software to let you know that you shouldn't be doing this. This is just something that you should be aware of in terms of getting good quality data. So I hope this short presentation clears things up for you. I know it is a bit confusing. If you do have questions, please let me know. You can always shoot me an email. And again, if you need the instrument data transferred, then you can also contact me or the rest of the staff, and we can help set you up with that.